Rachel, now that the paperwork is complete and we're formally underway, I want to start simply just by asking you, how is the sanction sitting with you right now?
Honestly, I still think it's unfair. I do understand the documentation issue, but the client signed the informed consent. She knew that texting wasn't appropriate, and I feel like the board ignored that part completely.
Mm. So it feels like the responsibility was placed entirely on you.
Well, yeah, I had clear policies, which the client knew, and I just can't abandon HIPAA because someone prefers texting.
Okay. I want to make sure I understand your perspective clearly. Do you believe the client was primarily responsible for the breakdown in continuity of care?
I think she chose not to follow the scheduling process. So, yeah, I think she had responsibility.
Primary responsibility?
Well, I think we both had roles, but she ignored the policy.
Hmm. When the investigator reviewed your charts, what did they note specifically?
In the main case, there was no documentation of outreach and no attempt to contact her through my EHR or by phone, and no termination summary.
And do you think that was accurate in their evaluation?
Yeah.
So
Do you believe the sanction was accurate? Do you believe I screwed up?
um, I'm not a fan of that term screwed up because I think all clinicians experience these ethical challenges and we make decisions for a lot of reasons. But based on what I read in the sanction, based on what you're describing and what you've confirmed, the board's finding related to client abandonment, and that aligns with what you're describing was missing in the documentation and in your activities. The ethical priority in a situation like that really isn't about enforcing policy. It was about ensuring reasonable effort toward continuity of care. And that doesn't mean your policy was wrong. It means your prioritization may not have aligned with how the board and our profession interprets our termination obligations.
Okay, so does that mean I'm supposed to chase clients now, even when they ignore clear instructions? Instructions that the board wants me to provide?
Not chase. I want to be clear about your word choice. It's not your obligation to chase clients, but you are obligated to make reasonable efforts that are documented. And those are two different things.
It just feels like no one looked at the fact that she signed the informed consent, and I think that matters.
I think it matters too. And this is what makes disciplinary supervision so complex. In disciplinary review, the board is less focused on whether the client followed policy and more focused on whether the clinician ensured continuity of care when that contact was disrupted. So it's not that what she did doesn't matter, it's that the board suggests that you have more power and therefore more responsibility. These two things, your client's responsibility and your power and responsibility, aren't emotionally equal priorities. And I want to explain something here that I think is important and may resonate with you. Most clinicians carry a quiet fear of the board, a fear of violating HIPAA, a fear of making the wrong move. And sometimes fear pushes us toward like a rigid consistency with paperwork instead of being flexible in our clinical responses. And I'm not saying that's what happened. I don't know enough about you and the sanction yet. but it is common for clinicians.
I just didn't want to violate HIPAA. I've always been very strict about that.
And that tells me something important. You were trying to protect yourself and your practice. And at the same time, the documentation reflects that no outreach occurred through HIPAA compliant channels. Both can be true. You were attempting to follow an important policy, and the board found continuity of care insufficient for your client. And you don't have to agree with the board's tone to understand their reasoning. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I still think it's excessive.
That makes sense emotionally. And part of our work here is separating what feels excessive from what is defensible under ethical review. So I want to be clear about my role. I'm not here to shame you. I'm not here to pile on to what's already been difficult for you. I am here to help you complete the sanctions successfully and to help you learn to prevent this or other violations in the future. If you leave this process stronger, with your actions more defensible and more confident about your ethical decision making, then this year won't have been a waste.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I definitely don't want this following me forever.
Well, then why don't we focus on tightening systems and deepening your ethical decision making skills rather than relitigating the sanction? If this exact situation happened tomorrow, what we really need to figure out is, what would you do? So I'm going to ask you that. If this happened tomorrow, what would you do?
I definitely document the text and maybe send a message through my EHR, but I still think clients need to follow the rules, especially when they've signed an informed consent.
I appreciate your transparency about that. It sounds like part of you is still weighing fairness, and that's okay. We don't have to resolve that today. For now, our goals are going to be strengthening your documentation structure, building consistent termination protocols, and reviewing how ethical decision making models can guide in gray areas what you prioritize as actions. So, right now, you don't have to agree with the board to complete this step well, but you do have to understand how they reason, how the board reasons through their decision making. Can you work inside that frame?
Yeah, I can do that.
Good. Well, let's just begin there. This is just the beginning. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of growth between now and the end of our year together. Hey, Rachel, today I'd like to spend most of our time reviewing your two attempts at that ethical decision making model that I assigned previously. I appreciate that you completed both models, and that matters. I'm most interested first in understanding how it felt to write them.
Well, honestly, a little stressful. I kept thinking, is this what she wants? I just didn't want to get it wrong.
Get the ethical analysis part wrong or get my evaluation wrong?
Probably the second one.
Thank you for acknowledging that. It's important to me to understand where you're coming from. Earlier in this process, you were focused on whether the board was wrong in their sanctioning of you. And now I'm hearing that you're focusing on whether I'm going to think you're wrong. That tells me something has shifted.
I definitely don't want to look incompetent, especially in writing, because that feels permanent.
Well, how about we look at your first attempt?
Okay.
Each of the 7 steps has one sentence in your response, and those sentences are technically correct, but they're sort of what I would consider surface level. And in our time together so far, I think you're a very deep thinker. And so that surface level, I don't think is really getting out the complexity or getting at the complexity with which you think. For example, in the identify stakeholders step, you listed the client and yourself. Is that accurate from your perspective?
Yeah.
Do you think that's complete?
Well, I mean, those are the two that are directly involved.
So let's slow this down as this was the only step you were going to work on for an entire day. And let's broaden the way that you're thinking about stakeholders. In a complaint reviewed by a licensing board, who else might be a stakeholder?
The board,
Yes. Who else?
uh, um, the practice, my practice.
Good. And anyone else or any other group?
I don't, I don't know. I guess maybe the profession.
Exactly. And on top of that, possibly your future clients, the public in terms of their perception of the mental health field or mental health professionals, maybe your colleagues. When we widen that stakeholder lens, something interesting happens. It sort of reduces an impulse to frame this as client versus clinician, the complainant versus you. And it becomes clinical decision making inside a professional system.
That feels bigger than what we're initially talking about. And I think I overthink this because I'm trying to write what sounds right.
Yeah, yes, that is exactly it. That is the issue. You're performing ethics instead of practicing ethics. So let me be direct. When your responses are one sentence long, they don't read as a thoughtful analysis aimed at accurate conceptualization of the problem or the potential solutions to the problem. It reads like avoidance or like you think the steps don't matter.
Of avoidance of what?
Well, you sort of mentioned it earlier, avoidance of exposing your reasoning, of letting me see how you actually think about the sanction.
Honestly, I don't want you to think I'm careless or rigid or that I still don't get it.
So instead of risking that depth, you stay very general in your responses.
Yeah.
Well, there's something parallel here. In the original situation, there was a moment or many moments, maybe, of discomfort in which you thought, darn it, this client texting isn't compliant, and she knows that. And as a result of that thought, maybe you were unable to pause and to expand the frame in the way that we just did. So your response was naturally very direct and rigid, maybe only focusing on one issue, HIPAA compliance. Right now, this discomfort feels something like, what will she think of my reasoning? So instead of expanding, you condense. Different situation, but sort of the same pattern.
I guess I hadn't thought about it that way, but I just don't think it's the same.
It may not be identical, but it does make me curious about your tolerance for ambiguity and exposure. All ethical decision making requires what I would call visible thinking, not necessarily polished thinking.
Mm.
I think you really want to do well. And so what you want me to see is the polished version. But let's redo just one step together and focus on stakeholders in this case. If you were to rewrite that step with depth, what might it sound like? And I want you to take your time. We'll just pause while you think about it.
Okay. Stakeholders include the client who may experience distress or abandonment if continuity of care is disrupted. Another one is myself, whose ethical standing and license are affected by termination decisions. The board, which evaluates whether professional standards are upheld. The public, who relies on clinicians to maintain a continuity of care. And the profession, which is impacted when termination practices are scrutinized or if they develop an inaccurate view of clinicians based on their experience with one person who they feel harmed them.
I'm listening to you, and now I'm seeing that significantly deeper thought process that I knew was in there, right? I want you to notice what just happened. You move from defending your policy to analyzing the potential impact for a number of stakeholders. And that's the work of an ethical decision making model. You're not being graded on your elegance when you write your responses. You're being evaluated on the depth of your ethical reasoning. And those are two different things.
It does still feel like I'm being judged.
Well, in some ways you are. I would call it evaluation. You're being evaluated. The goal of the evaluation is to lead to growth, professional growth. The goal of judgment is to condemn, right? And I don't want to condemn. I want to help you grow. So it's my obligation to evaluate whether you can do this work at a deep level. And avoiding depth to protect yourself from judgment will keep you stuck. Here's what I'm seeing. Your defensiveness since we started meeting, it has decreased. You're engaging in these ideas. They might sort of come at you like judgment, but you are open to hearing them. You're trying to do the work that I'm asking you to do. But your anxiety about how you're perceived is still limiting your processing, your analysis. Now, overall, that's good news. It means that you're getting a little bit past that blaming stage. And now we're working together to sort of integrate the importance of a really in-depth analysis. So for your homework, what I'd like you to do is reattempt that ethical decision-making model for the same case, but by expanding each step, especially the consequences of your choice, and even practice getting a consultation. That could be with one of your favorite colleagues or a former professor or someone that you respect. And I really want to see you articulate what might have happened if you had consulted with somebody. And then I want you to write a short reflection. How can client-centered communication coexist with a firm policy reinforcement? But I want you to really try hard to avoid writing what sounds correct. I want to see you write what you actually think.
Okay, I get it. And I will try not to overdo it.
Yeah. You don't need to worry about impressing me. I care more about where you're actually at than being impressed. So let me see how you're thinking. That really is going to where we're going to reduce liability. And that's how we grow, all of us as clinicians. That's how we grow, is by being vulnerable and having people provide feedback about that. Rachel, thanks for coming in again. I was really excited to see you today. I reviewed your most recent ethical decision making model as part of the evidence I used to support this quarter's evaluation. This is significantly stronger work. I can see you shaking your head like you know it's stronger. Your stakeholder analysis was thorough. You included the board, the profession, the public. Your consequences section was so much more detailed. What felt different this time?
I tried not to rush it. I forced myself to sit with each step instead of just writing something efficient.
Hmm. I can see that. It reads like thinking, not performing. Like I can see your thoughts on the page. So great job. Now it makes me want to shift what we're focusing on slightly. We have been strengthening those ethical analysis skills. And now I want to get to like a layer below those skills and to talk a little bit about the anxiety behind that original hesitation to put yourself on the page.
Oh, okay.
Across sessions, I've noticed something consistent. When you feel evaluated and you just did this, you tighten a little bit. You start to over control language, you start to talk about your policies. And when those policies feel threatened, you sort of double down. You go back to that sort of narrow thinking. Does that feel accurate?
I just like things to be done correctly.
Correctly or perfectly?
Perfectly, I guess.
I saw the tone drop like you've heard this before or you know this about yourself. Perfectionism in clinicians is really praised. Think about it. We encourage it in graduate school. We want people to excel and give us their best effort. Perfectionism looks like thoroughness. But in ethical gray areas, and most ethical issues are gray areas, that perfectionism can become rigidity, and rigidity overrides clinical judgment. And that's what concerns me. That's what I want to get at by talking about that anxiety.
I don't think I'm rigid.
Not globally rigid, but when you feel anxious, at least in our experience together, you tend to default towards structure over relationship. How can I write this better? What is the better way to produce this product? What is the next step I need to complete? And that's structure over relationship. In the original case, policy became the anchor rather than your responsibility for continuity of care for your client.
But structure protects us and documentation protects us, and the board even says that.
Yes, structure reduces liability, but ethical practice is not structure alone. It's structure in service of client welfare. The structure has a purpose. Like there's a destination we're trying to get to, and the structure helps us get to it, but it is not the all encompassing focus. When structure becomes self protection first, care narrows. So I'm going to ask Rachel, what are you most afraid I'll discover about you if you make a mistake again?
That I didn't learn anything that I wasted this year.
That feels very heavy. And I want you to dig in and go a layer deep.
That maybe I shouldn't be doing this work. I mean, not that I actually think that, I just don't want that narrative in my head or in anyone else's.
I can see your eyes welling up a little bit. This feels very vulnerable for you. And I would suspect that this is shame talking, not you being an incompetent clinician. Shame-driven perfectionism is really risky in clinicians because when mistakes feel intolerable or like mistakes mean something deeply about our ability to do this work, we naturally want to hide the things we think we're doing wrong. In fact, in supervision literature, non-disclosure is strongly associated with fear of negative evaluation. So when your internal rule is, I can't be wrong, I must not be found out to be wrong, your brain is always going to look for ways to avoid exposure. We think we're setting clear ethical boundaries, but really that's how ethical drift begins because we're not making comprehensive logical decisions. Our decisions are driven by emotion we're not even aware of, the kind of emotion that you're having right now.
I wouldn't hide something intentionally.
I don't believe you would hide something maliciously. But perfectionism doesn't usually announce itself. It doesn't say, hey, you're feeling vulnerable right now, and therefore act this way. It shows up like, I handled this, I followed the policy, or it's fine. The client made this mistake, and now she's paying consequences for it. Or I don't need to consult. I have a written policy. I know what needs to happen next. And then no one sees that pressure building. Your anxiety and perfectionism may or may not be a part of your personality, but they can be clinical risk factors for rigidity or over control. And like in your case, policy over care. I believe you need some help evaluating and managing these tendencies. So I'm going to add personal counseling to your remediation plan, and not from a punitive perspective, but from a protective one, protective for you and your clients.
I see what you're saying, but I am a licensed clinician. I don't think I need therapy.
You know, needing support is not evidence of incompetence. In fact, the most ethically resilient clinicians I know, including me, actively address their blind spots in therapy. This isn't about pathology, it's about patterns. In your case, fear of being wrong led to rigid adherence to a policy, and that rigidity contributed to client abandonment. If we only strengthen your use of the ethical decision-making model without addressing the anxiety underneath it, we're treating symptoms, not the driver. And you know what it means as a clinician to only treat symptoms.
I just don't want this to define me.
Then we get to the root of it. You're not being referred because you're unstable. You're being referred because you're capable. And capable clinicians deserve full support and as much self-awareness as we can get. Again, I can't say this enough. This referral is important. And because of that, I'm going to make it part of your remediation plan. You can choose the provider that is the best fit for you. We can work through that fit if you want to in our sessions. And at the very least, I will require you to sign a release so I can affirm your attendance and that the content you're discussing relates to this anxiety and perfectionism. But it's not going to be optional.
Okay, I'll do it. I'm still not convinced I need it, but I'll do it.
That's fair enough for today. I think your ambivalence is appropriate and honest, and I appreciate that you respect my judgment about this. So, for your homework, I want you to work on finding a good fit clinician. I know it can take a while to get into a clinician, so I can be flexible about how quickly that happens, but I want to see who you've talked to or who you think might be available and whether or not you have an appointment scheduled. I also want you to journal about how anxiety and perfectionism show up in your clinical work, maybe in other ways, maybe when you're sitting in the room with clients or how you're writing notes. And I want you to apply the ethical decision making model to a completely different case, one where you might have felt pressure again to get things exactly right. And remember, I'm not looking for the polished model, not the most efficient model. I want your real thoughts on the paper. I think most importantly, I want you to remember that you're not here because you are innately unethical. You're here because you're human. We forget that in this profession, that we're humans. We are people behind our practices. And humans under pressure default to patterns. So I'm going to help you reshape those patterns.
Okay.